so glad you're here. We're especially glad to our colleagues from the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, who will be here sharing their expertise and their work and sharing with us all ways that we can be involved in this really important ministry and identifying opportunities to learn more. So thank you to them. A few housekeeping notes just to start. You may have gotten the message that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available following this conversation so that you can look back and share it with others in your congregations and help spread the word about this really critical area of work. For those who want to ask questions, we will have time at the end for questions. Please ask questions using the Q&A feature rather than the chat. That can help us just keep track of everything and make sure that we're answering and responding to the questions that all of you have as participants. And following this, we will share resources and links. So if there's particular resources that are identified today, we will be able to follow up with you so you can track those down and use them. I will start also by saying my name's Rebecca Blatchley. I'm the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations Director, and I am also a proud board member of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, where over the past few years I have been deeply moved and inspired to learn about their work, to partner alongside them in this really incredible work. And I'm, as I said, thrilled to be able to have a chance for you all to hear from them today. Just a quick note about the Office of Government Relations and how we do our work, for those of you who are not familiar. We are the Washington-based Office of the Episcopal Church, and we represent the policy priorities of the church to the government in Washington. We were established in 1979, and since then have been advocating for the hundreds of public policy resolutions that General Convention and Executive Council, the governing bodies of the church, have given us. The church has been long-standing in advocacy around criminal justice reform and around human rights, both of which are touched on and will be touched on today. So we always invite your participation in webinars like these. We hope you join the Episcopal Public Policy Network so you can take action on our alerts like the one we sent out today that you'll be hearing more about to end solitary confinement. And we also have weekly calls every Thursday, monthly call at night to just give updates on what's happening in Congress. We also invite you to be in conversation with us for that. So let me turn now to my colleagues so we can really hear from them and learn today. So I'm just thrilled to have Laura and Johnny here. So I'll first introduce Laura Markle-Doughton, who is a leading strategist and organizer in the field of criminal legal reform. She is the Director of Faith and Community Engagement with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, where she has been since 2013. She works to resource and organize faith leadership at the state and federal campaigns to end torture at the local and national level. She has incredible experience mobilizing faith communities. I've seen it happen, and I've been so grateful to her for all of her leadership. She also serves on the Joint Action and Advocacy for Justice and Peace Convening Table of the National Council of Churches, and holds an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, as well as certificates in trauma awareness, and is a board certified health and wellness coach. So Laura, thank you so much for being here. I'll introduce Johnny and then turn it over to you, Laura. Johnny Perez is the director of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture's U.S. Prisons Program. Johnny is a highly accomplished criminal justice reform advocate, an incredible and powerful public speaker, a thought leader in the field of ending torture and inhumane treatment in the U.S. prison systems. He champions an end to solitary confinement, which we will hear about today, and helps faith communities like ours and affected individuals to engage in education and legislative changes nationwide. Johnny represents NEARCAT in organizations like Unlock the Box, which is a national campaign to end solitary confinement, the Federal Anti-Solitary Task Force, and he's on the board of directors of the National Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration. There's more, of course, that I could say about both of our panelists, but primarily I'm just want to turn to them, make sure we can hear from them and hear their stories, and then learn how we can do more. So with that, Laura, let me turn to you.
Great, Rebecca, thank you so much, and just very glad to be able to be with you all and share this time today. So I wanted to start off by just giving folks a brief introduction to the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, a little bit about our history and the organization itself. So the National Religious Campaign Against Torture is a national interfaith membership organization that was founded in 2006. Originally in response to the release of the Abu Ghraib torture photos, out of a deep hunger for an interfaith response to that program, and what has grown from that initial gathering is now more than 300 interfaith organizations and religious bodies from around the country who've become members of our network. The Episcopal Church, it's worth noting, was one of the founding members of NEARCAT, and so we have a long history of collegiality and working together, and are grateful for that. And really celebrate that, and are glad to be here with you all to talk about the work today and really what we can do together moving forward. So NEARCAT, at its heart, our stated purpose is to work together across, inspired by our faith, many different traditions, to end torture in U.S. policy, practice, and culture. And while a lot of our conversation today will be around policy change, it's really ultimately our desire to change the culture that condones policies of torture. And that's where we really see the faith community leading and having an important moral voice in these conversations. With that, I want to turn it over to Johnny to talk a little bit about the topic that brings us here today, solitary confinement. Our U.S. prisons work is very much focused on working to end the torture of solitary confinement. And so we wanted to start with what is it and how do people end up there? So I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you for that, Laura, and thank you for that, Rebecca, for that intro. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johnny Perez, as Laura mentioned. And, for those who don't know what solitary confinement is, some describe solitary confinement as a prison inside of a prison. It's 23 to 24 hours a day where you are locked inside of a space the same size as your bathroom. People are placed there for a number of different reasons. The media might have you think that, it's the worst of the worst that's placed in solitary, but the truth is that 4 out of 5 people who are in solitary are there for minor offenses. Folks are there for, substance use, for having someone else's clothes on, for using a phone when they're not allowed, for being in a different part of the facility, for completely nonviolent acts, contrary to popular belief. I myself was in solitary confinement for 3 years for cannabis consumption. Now at a time where people are being released, and not only being released, but also where cannabis is actually being legalized in a number of states. We still have many parts of the country that actually hold people inside of these spaces because of it. Along with our partners at the Unlock the Box campaign and Solitary Watch, we recently released a report called Calculating Torture. We wanted to get the exact number of people who were inside of solitary confinement, and according to their findings, they found 122,000 people at any given time, and I'll drop this in the chat for you all, are placed inside of these spaces. Across the country, in jails, prisons, and even detention centers. I'll say that most of these people are people of color, Black and white folks, just like Black and white folks who are speaking, who are currently held inside of these spaces. Most of these people are held in state prisons and local jails with the majority of these folks. And we do have state-level campaigns that are seeking to end solitary confinement in these states, and we have had some successes, particularly in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, with some positive momentum in Louisiana and Virginia. Just to kind of step back a little bit, part of the way that we do the work is that one of the values that we hold is that we value proximity to the problem, and in order to be able to come up with effective solutions, we really like to engage people who are solitary survivors, folks who've been harmed by the torture of solitary, including their families, to come up with effective long-term solutions and alternatives to what works. To that end, NEARCAT has a national network of solitary survivors, which in fact, we just had our first call very recently. And there we hope to support solitary survivors and put them in leadership positions within their campaigns, within the public, to educate the public on issues of confinement. And of course, just like, and also traditional mentoring. I'll say something about the campaigns, that the campaigns are all led by solitary survivors, hence the importance of having folks with such proximity to the issue leading these campaigns. You know, I'm emphasizing the firsthand knowledge of the system's harms. And the last thing I'll add about that is that through the Unlock the Box campaign, we've been able to work with 21 state level campaigns that are doing amazing and inspiring work. And while we've had successes with it, we still have ongoing fights. You know, in California, to name one, which, you know, Laura can get into a little bit later. Georgia continues to be one. You know, and even in states where we don't have active campaigns like Texas and Florida, you know, there's still atrocities there that we try to, we try to support mitigating. Like, for example, in Texas, for example, where in the summertime it gets about 120 degrees inside of those cells. You know, we supported campaigns there to include air conditioning, making sure that people are able to breathe. I'll talk a little bit later more about some of our legislation that we have, you know, and that we're pushing. But what I mentioned in terms of folks that are directly impacted, one of the ways that we try to do that is we try to do the work with them is that we try to amplify their voices within the media and the public sphere. You know, I myself, when I came home 10 years ago, it was a time when I just shared my story almost every day, and it was really good to be able to let people know what's happening inside. There's no cameras inside. I barely got visits. There's a lot of harm that happens inside, you know, and to be able to kind of shed light on the darkness that happens inside of these cells and these prisons, and inside of these spaces. For example, when we saw Khalif Browder getting, you know, pulled out of his cell, you know, in the news and things like that, it kind of adds some reality to it. So about 1.5 years ago, NEARCAT embarked on a media project called the Humans Out of Solitary Project, where we interviewed 30 people who all experienced solitary confinement to hear directly from them about the impacts of it, and a number of different issues concerning the issue of solitary confinement. From mental health impacts, as we know, there's irreversible damage to people that are placed inside of these spaces for 15 days or more, hence why there's international standards that have come out against the use of solitary confinement, the long-term effects on the community. We think about people in prison, but we sometimes forget that each person represents a family member in a community, in a family, and that family also represents a community. So it not just harms the person inside who's directly harmed by it, but the ecosystem of every person that cares or has come and will come to interact with this person, if you will. So I want to take a moment to share my screen. I'm going to share a video from Eddie Ellis, who is part of our national network. In fact, I just saw him recently in DC, and he's also a newly published author. He's also a person that's been incarcerated for a number of years, and I'll let you all hear directly from him. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now.
As a society, we value community, public safety, and even second chances. Yet, across the United States, there are countless people who are being subjected to the torture of solitary confinement. And although many have not survived such dehumanizing conditions, for those who do, they have lived long enough to tell their truth, share their journeys of resilience, and more importantly, to challenge our moral compass. Here's what they had to say.
My name is Eddie Ellis, and I'm a survivor of solitary confinement. And I work for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, where we help to ban the practice of life without parole for children nationally. Good thing about it is that, you know, I have a chance to work with so many people across the country because we're a national organization. And the unfortunate part is I can guarantee you that each and every ICANN member, which is 198 at this time, have been in solitary confinement one way or another. Children are different. Scientists, doctors recognize these things, right? So if we're saying a child's brain doesn't fully mature up until the age of 25, what do you think happens to a young person when you put them in solitary confinement or in these prisons? their brain is not developing the way that they should develop, because they're in an unnatural place that's very harmful emotionally and mentally, right? Which is affecting the body and the growth of the brain of the child, right? So we are actually harming people, children, when we place them in these unhealthy environments. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, but it's a nightmare that you can't dream up unless you experience it. You know, people have dreams of things they've never done in their life, but I can guarantee you nobody's ever had a dream about being in solitary confinement, because it's something someone can't really think of without experiencing it. And I can tell you it's emotionally, mentally, and physically harmful for kids. You know, I can tell you, for myself, I mean, my eyes is messed up from being in solitary confinement. My back, I got, my back, my hips from laying on them hard concrete beds for so many years. You know, so mentally, I dealt with so much. I was diagnosed with PTSD when I came home, and post-incarceration stress syndrome when I came home, anxiety, issues when I came home. And like I said, this year will be my 16th year home, and I still deal with anxiety in certain situations. I still feel like I'm claustrophobic in certain situations, and I do have nightmares about living in solitary confinement for 10 years. So it's something that I feel will never go away, but it's something that I try to adjust to each day that I get up, and try to be honest with myself about what I'm feeling so that I can find a good resolution for myself, for my family, for my work, and the people that I stand beside and support, so it's harmful.
Hearing Eddie talk reminds me, he talked about how his eyes, are still messed up. He's served 10 years in solitary confinement. He's been home for 16 years now. And I think I want folks to understand, there are people who are released directly from these sensory deprived spaces directly into solitary. I myself wear glasses because for years I couldn't see longer, no more than 6 feet in front of me, and there's been, and being exposed to solitary has irreversible damage. I think John Hopkins University found that people who experience solitary die at a higher rate than everyone. They die from overdose. They die from a number of different elements that their counterparts in the general population doesn't. And when we release people directly from this environment into society, and then we just ask them to assimilate, it's like asking a fish to climb a tree, and then we blame the individual, or with parole and a number of things, and I also add that up until not too long ago, we still do, in fact, that we keep children and young people inside of these spaces, which says more about us than it says about them, right? About how we treat people says more about us than it says about them. Hence, many of our bills limit solitary to no more than 15 days, some even less. The federal bill limits it to just 4 hours, which I'll get into later. We just really wanted to emphasize how atrocious the monster is. And then I'll say this last thing, that is not about, it's not about not holding people accountable. I get that question, well, Johnny, you just want to let anyone do anything. And I think that we can hold people accountable while at the same time treating them like humans in the process of that. So with that, I'll give it back over to my colleague Laura to talk about the faith engagement work that we do. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Johnny. And a big thanks to Eddie Ellis for sharing his story. So when we think about what it means for people of faith and religious communities to be a part of this effort, there is so much to do, and there are so many important ways to plug in. So I want to talk briefly about some of the resources that NEARCAT makes available to congregations to get you thinking about how you might make use of them or work with us and be a part of some of this. So at the end of the day, NEARCAT thinks about how do we connect, educate, and advocate together in a way that, as Johnny said, really follows the lead of the true experts, those who have survived solitary confinement and their loved ones who have endured knowing that their loved one is enduring this kind of sensory deprivation day in and day out. One of the easiest ways to get started is to host a film screening. NEARCAT developed last year a documentary that's 35 minutes long called Torture in Our Name. And it was really designed for faith audiences as a very invitational film to learn about the issue, to hear directly from survivors who have led successful campaigns in New York, New Jersey, and Louisiana. And to really help that be a conversation opener for what it means to be compelled by your faith to take action locally. As Johnny mentioned, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture is a part of the broader Unlock the Box campaign, which was founded with the ambitious goal of ending the torture of solitary confinement in 10 years. And that campaign is made up of faith allies led by survivors, as well as colleagues from the medical, mental health, and legal communities. And so out of that sort of partnership, we're currently in contact with and resourcing 20 state campaigns, legislative campaigns to end solitary. So the Torture in Our Name film is one just great way to open that conversation in your congregation. We have an interfaith discussion guide that is set up to have both printout handouts as well as to really make it simple for anyone who may have less familiarity with the topic to still host an event and get the conversation going. We've also got promo materials already created. So we call this project our Just Add Water. We really want to make this as easy as possible for you, for your congregation to take it on. And I want to thank Johnny for putting in the chat a link, or he will be putting in the chat a link that will take you to the landing page for the film itself. And then there you'll find the resources that I mentioned. Another really important piece of the puzzle for us is ensuring that congregations connect directly with leaders with firsthand experience of solitary. And, Johnny mentioned the NEARCAT National Network of Solitary Survivors. That is a wonderful way to connect up with a local leader who can speak to your congregation. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, please reach out to Johnny and me. We would love to work with you to connect you with a leader from the network who could come out and speak to your congregation, be a part of a film screening. NEARCAT very much prioritizes that people be compensated for the labor of sharing their story and being a part of that. So we can also make stipends available for presenters if you're planning an event with your congregation. So I hope that gets some creative ideas going for you, and really I hope you'll make use of reaching out to us to help make that a reality. Lastly, I want to mention again and just underscore the Humans Out of Solitary series. Obviously, you just saw one piece from Mr. Ellis, but those are another great resource. They're only 2 to 3 minutes long, and so we could consider using one, let's say, to open an advocacy meeting or a prayer gathering. It's a great way to infuse the conversation with someone who has been there, and ultimately to really challenge people to think again about the misconceptions that we've been fed about who it is that's ending up in these inhumane conditions of torture in prisons and jails and detention centers in our communities all around the country. So those are just a few resources from NEARCAT that we wanted to make sure you're aware of and that we really hope that you will make use of. I wanted to speak briefly just to 2 state examples from the last year where the faith community has really dug in and made a contribution in state campaigns. I know Johnny mentioned that very often in these campaigns, we're looking to the United Nations human rights standards put forth by what's called the Nelson Mandela Rules, which was an update to the UN standard treatment for standards for the treatment of individuals who are incarcerated. And as a part of that standard, it identifies more than 15 days for anyone being placed in solitary confinement as a form of torture that should be subject to abolition. And so it goes further to say that, for those that are most vulnerable, including youth, pregnant people, individuals with mental disabilities, that they should not be subject to any time in solitary confinement. And so those have been two guideposts for us in many of the state campaigns, including in New York and New Jersey, who have both passed laws that implement a ban on prolonged isolation and protect the most vulnerable from time in isolation. In the state of Maine, earlier this year, NEARCAT partnered with the Maine Council of Churches to actually host a statewide virtual screening of Torture in Our Name. So I want you to think big picture. You don't have to, you can do this locally, but we love to do this collaboratively. The Maine Council invited their partners around the state to view the film, and then had a powerful panel discussion afterward that included clergy from around the state as well as survivors to really hear about what solitary looks like in their state and what they can do there. Getting even more in the weeds, in California, I wanted to speak briefly to that campaign. As many of you know, California, for the last 2 years, the California legislature has actually passed what's called the California Mandela Act, which would codify the ban that I was speaking to, would ban prolonged isolation in prisons, jails, as well as for-profit immigrant detention centers statewide. That bill has now it was vetoed by Governor Newsom in 2022. And so in 2023, the faith community was very focused on making a clear moral appeal to the governor to call on him to sign this bill into law. And as a part of that, just in the last few months, NEARCAT gathered about a dozen clergy to actually meet with Governor Newsom's staff and deliver a letter, an interfaith letter signed by 38 leading religious organizations from around the state, urging him to support that bill and sign it into law under moral grounds. I did want to note that we were joined in that letter by the Episcopal Public Policy Network of California, and we're thrilled to have their representative with us when we met with Governor Newsom's staff. Essentially, the bill is now a 2-year bill, so we will be back next year, but Governor Newsom remains a major barrier to that bill, and we will be continuing to look at what does it mean for people of faith to be making the moral appeal to him and to the legislature in California to make that bill a reality. It's worth noting that California was really put on the map about 10 years ago in terms of the movement to end solitary after historic hunger strikes took place statewide there, in which incarcerated people from around the state, as a result of their action, really called legislators to take note of the need to end the reality that people in California remain in solitary for years and decades. When we think about the UN standard of more than 15 days as torture, it's humbling to consider the reality of what people have endured and are enduring. So those are just 2 examples. I hope that they can be useful to you. Obviously, one is more thinking about what it means to use some of our multimedia resources. The other is to really consider, working with us deeply in some of these states where the legislative campaigns are very active, and really finding what it means for your faith community to find their voice in the midst of these efforts. So I want to stop it there and pass it back over to you, Johnny, and to hear more about what this effort looks like at the federal level.
Yeah, thank you for that. So about 2 years ago, NEARCAT, along with the Vera Institute of Justice, the ACLU's National Prison Project, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the National Unlock the Box campaign, and the Halt Solitary campaign out of New York, and also Zealous, which they're engaged the media, got together and decided to draft and craft a bill to end solitary confinement at the federal level that went further than that had been before and what exists now. The result of that has been, and I'll drop some language here in the chat. And the result of that has been the Ending Solitary Confinement Act. In its launch, so far already, we've already garnered 20 House co-sponsors, and it came with the endorsement of 170 organizations nationwide, including more than 30 faith organizations. So what does the bill do exactly, right? The bill terminates solitary confinement and solitary confinement in federal prisons, jails, and other detentions and immigration detention settings, except for limited situations, including a maximum of 4 hours, specifically for emergency de-escalation. It protects vulnerable populations. I'll backtrack a little bit. The reason, so we've seen 4 hours actually work in the juvenile system, and trying to go further than just 15 days in the States, right? I'll remind folks that we do live in a country where we keep people in solitary for decades at a time. You just heard Eddie Ellis say he spent 10 years in solitary. Jack Morris, who's one of the leaders in California, who also sits on our advisory council, did 40 years in solitary. I'm only 44. He did more than half my life inside of these spaces. So when we think about solitary, we know that part of the reason is torture is also because people are held a lot of times indefinitely, and the effects are also indefinite. This includes excluding people from being placed there in the first time for any amount of time. You know, whether that is women who are expecting, vulnerable populations, people who are developmentally disabled, people who have mental health challenges, young people, you know, who should not be placed in these places at all. Increase out of cell time. To have at least 14 hours out of cell time. That includes group out of cell interactions in congregate settings. You know, as it stands right now, there's a lot of places where people are literally there for 23 to 24 hours a day. And the reason sometimes it's 24 hours a day is because people sometimes just refuse to go out, or something prevents them from going out. Like, for example, they may knock on your cell door at 6 a.m. to go outside at 10 below and then offer you that 1 hour, which many people just refuse. You know, and then to answer the question that is always asked, well, Johnny, if not solitary, then what? There are alternatives that do exist. So, you know, that means that people can get that out of cell time. That includes programming to address potentially what got them there in the first place. You know, whether it's mental health, you know, services, whether it's substance abuse services, whether it's trauma services, to ensure that, you know, folks get access to the therapeutic services that they need. I also mentioned that the bill includes due process protections for people that are placed in these settings in the first place, right? To ensure, you know, oh, sorry, I put the wrong thing in there. Due process. Strict due process protocols in place for people that are being placed inside of these spaces, especially if their diets are restricted, and other like punitive measures like being held in restraints. As it stands right now, there are times when people are held in restraints for hours, if not days at a time. There's times when people are restricted their diet. What does that look like? That looks like the mess hall giving, it was called the loaf, which is basically the leftovers from all the week's mess hall food, and they do some concoction with bread, and that's like literally all you get. Many people have lost weight. I myself, when I went into solitary, I was 178 pounds. And when I came out, my longest term at one time was 10 months, and I was about 150 pounds or something like that. So you get that extreme weight loss that, you know, also has the physical ramifications of being placed inside of there. One thing I'm excited about is just having oversight and enforcement about the bill. You know, we've seen some of these successes around oversight in other states. In New Jersey, for example, their bill does include, you know, oversight. And in fact, currently right now, they're staffing the ombudsman's office that's going to be doing oversight on the bill in New Jersey with folks who are directly impacted by solitary. One leader is Nafisa, who worked with us as part of a network, who actually just took on a role with that oversight board. So it's great to have a solitary survivor on an oversight board on a bill that she actually worked to push and pass. So that's rewarding on a lot of different levels. Community monitoring and ensuring that the media has access to the space. As we know now, part of the reason that these places are that we don't get accurate information about what's going on in this, because prisons just simply do not like the media inside. They restrict access to the media. In fact, they restrict access to the public as a whole, but especially the media. And then lastly, it incentivizes states in the form of a penalty for those who do not reduce their footprints on solitary to specific programs, et cetera. The bill actually that got a lot of media coverage for its release. I'll share this NBC exclusive on the act here in the chat, so you can all have that. And yeah, we need your support. And I'll say, and before I pass it to Laura and Rebecca to talk about ways to support, I'll say that there is no small thing you can do. There's not an idea of I can't do anything. I think everyone can do anything, big or small, and there's a number of ways that you can engage. So thank you for letting me share that as well.
Thank you so much, Johnny, and thanks for sharing all that information with us. Our Episcopal Public Policy Network today shared an action alert on the legislation on the End Solitary Confinement Act, so it's up on our website. I'll share a link, but if you are an Episcopal Public Policy member, this is the perfect time to ask your member to co-sponsor the legislation. We need more co-sponsors. This needs to gain momentum and get some traction. There was a question I saw about what's happening at the state and federal level. So this is the federal focused legislation that we're supporting in partnership with NERCAD and learning from them and from the expertise that you all are hearing from today. And then, of course, there's many efforts also at the state level that Laura and Johnny spoke about. So depending on where you live, there may be opportunities to get involved at the state level. The Office of Government Relations, we just focus on federal, but we're always thrilled to be able to connect you to organizations doing the state level work, for you to be able to get more involved. We know that so much happens at the state level, for good and for ill. So to be able to get involved at the state level is critically important. We'll be pushing for this at the federal level, again, because of the provisions that Johnny highlighted that we think are really critical. And just to say a word about the Episcopal Church's engagement on this issue, in the 2018 General Convention, we were able to work with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture to have a virtual solitary confinement cell. So people could, through virtual reality, kind of have the experience and learn a little bit more about what it would be like. As Johnny mentioned, the size of a small bathroom in some instances, and recognizing the number of hours per day, again, for days and days and months, and for people years, and some people even decades being put in that situation. So I think as a result of that, the 2018 General Convention did put forward a specific resolution condemning solitary confinement, and urging all members of our church to advocate for its end, to affirm the UN stance that prolonged solitary confinement is a form of torture, and to say that we should all do what we can to end it. So I would just echo the call to be involved in that. And again, especially for those Episcopalians who are in states who do have a local network you can get involved with, like in California. We've had some of our bishops be really involved, I know, in California as well. So there are opportunities to work with faith partners, Episcopal and otherwise, on this legislation. So I'll share our action alert in the chat if you haven't taken action already today, and also our 2018 resolution. Laura, but I can hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. And I would just add, NERCAD has a 2-pager on the End Solitary Confinement Act that we've also shared in the chat, and would urge you to consider spaces where you might share that, and make folks aware of it. Truly the fact that we are having a conversation at the federal level about limiting solitary in this way really is a testament to the years of work that survivors of solitary, along with allies from the faith community, have really accomplished in terms of shifting the conversation towards a focus on human rights and a call for a restorative alternative to solitary. So, I would just underscore Rebecca's call and urge you to use the action alerts that the office has provided there. And, you know, our ambitious focus now is really to add over 100 co-sponsors to the bill as it currently stands in the House. So each one of you can be a part of that by taking action in support of the bill. And the one other thing I do want to note there is that I know that some people come with a greater focus on the criminal legal system and others on the immigrant rights and immigrant detention system. And just want to note that the federal bill is one that does address the use of solitary, including in federal immigrant detention. And so, you know, we really see the importance of ensuring that we're addressing this form of torture in all settings. And that's something important that the In Solitary Confinement Act does. So I will leave it there and pass it back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. It looks like we have some questions, so we can take our remaining time for some questions. So first, there's a question for both of you about ensuring that when we advocate to end solitary confinement, that we're also addressing that solitary confinement can sometimes be referred to with different names. So whether it's called segregated or structured housing or some other renamed but still isolating experience. So is that something that you're seeing? And then what can we do as advocates to make sure that there's not an end to solitary where people sort of end up in situations that are similarly damaging and inhumane and isolating?
Yeah, I can take that on. You can add on if you want. Yeah, I think so that's a really good question. You know, I'll name one of the characteristics that we see in the work that we do is that DOC does like to change the name, call it someone else to say that it no longer exists. And we know that we can't just change the name of something and then it just goes away, that we have to have actual structural change. To combat that, you know, we don't just describe solitary confinement by name, we also describe it by characteristics. In this case, by the amount of time that people are spending inside. So we say in any setting that a person is inside of a space that is 14 hours or more, in some states, et cetera. Now we continue to move the needle on that, hence why we're trying to push this federal bill. So for example, you know, in some states, yes, it may be characterized by 23 hours in a day, but in states where we've already passed legislation, like in New York, for example, you know, solitary there is defined now as anything more than, it's 14, you have to have more than 7 hours in cell, 14 hours out of cell time, you know, and then on the federal level, once we were successful with ESCA, it'll be anything more than 4 hours. But when we're in states where it's 23 hours or more, we really just try to describe the characteristics. Any place where someone is held, you know, for 14 hours or more is considered solitary confinement. And in fact, in the federal bill, we actually put specific language in there in terms of the specific time to try to close those loopholes on the language. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, that's great. And I would just build on that to say that, you know, in many states, the process that we've seen folks go through is initially needing to work on a definitions bill to clarify that very issue, to make it abundantly clear, particularly to legislators and lawmakers, what we are talking about, you know, and when and where there's sort of a refusal by departments of correction to acknowledge the use of solitary confinement, you know, to use the terminology that they use, restrictive housing. You know, some states have gotten very creative, even calling solitary confinement restorative housing. So we really have to be rigorous about that language. So I really appreciate that the person brought that up, and that becomes often a really important piece of the puzzle. It's also why it's so critical that we have survivors who have been there at the table, because you know, they are the experts who can call legislators and decision makers back to the reality of the conditions that they have faced and that they know people are enduring inside.
Thank you both. Really helpful answers, and thank you for the thoughtful question as well. This is a little bit of a broader question, kind of pulling some of the questions we've received together, but what are the politics around this? So why did Governor Newsom, why has he not moved forward with the bill? Who are those who are advocating for the status quo. You know, because I think it's critical that we understand that. Yeah, if one of you can go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be glad to start. And Johnny, please add on. There are a number of dynamics at play, but one that's important to understand is the economics of the politics. So in a state like California, where the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, or we often call it CDC, because we don't see true rehabilitation as a reality there, that the CDC is one of the largest employers in the state. And so when you think about a voting block for a governor like Newsom, you know, obviously, you know, you're thinking about the pressures that are there in that regard. There's also perverse economic incentive in terms of for departments of correction to want to maintain the current practice. Often in many states, in California is certainly an example of this, where the department is allocated significantly more money per person if the person is held in segregated housing or isolated confinement. I believe upwards of $20,000 additional per person. So the incentive is certainly there for sort of maintaining a sizable budget to not change the conditions that the people are being housed in. You know, I think beyond that, there's also you know, a resistance that is rooted in a false narrative about who it is that is ending up there. And so it's really a point where, you know, utilizing our resources like the Humans Out of Solitary films, where we can really push back against sort of dehumanizing political messaging about what it means for us as a society to have people who are incarcerated, and why are they there in the first place. So I want to pass it off to Johnny for anything else on that.
I think you hit it right on the head. You know, I think, like, you know, we were talking to I won't name the legislator in the moment, but like sometimes, you know, it just gets so impersonal, you know, and part of it is just like a lot of the folks, they just don't have proximity like to the issue. You know, a lot of correctional officers do. And it's funny because correctional officers also harm themselves as well by solitary, a lot of the stats. So they have a higher incidences of divorce rates, they have an incidence of suicide, they have an incidence of alcoholism, you know, so also impacted as well. But that voting block is mainly like Laura mentioned. So yeah, thanks.
And this is just building on that a little bit, but we did get this question about the alternatives. Just need, you know, in the event of there being a safety concern, just how do you speak about that if you get this kind of pushback?
In terms of safety concerns?
In the community, I mean, sort of among incarcerated people, I guess, just when you get the pushback from legislators who maybe don't know as much, how do you help educate them? Just if you can say a little bit more along those same lines.
Yeah, you know, it's a few things there. Definitely don't visit a legislator without someone who's also survived solitary in the room with you. You know, the other piece is like what we're advocating for is that unless there is imminent danger to self or others, you know, and then only until the situation has been de-escalated with an hourly check-in. So, you know, like, yes, let's address the issue if someone needs to be safe, but then also let's just not keep them in there, you know, for weeks, months, or years at a time because of it. You know, and I'll say that many people, you know, land in solitary, and then when you get in there, you get more tickets or misbehavior reports that only leads to more time in solitary that have nothing to do with the original offense. So you'll have someone go into solitary for 30 days for, I don't know, using the phone when they're not supposed to, and then end up in there with years of time in solitary because of subsequent offenses. There's also a false narrative about who's there. You know, in New York alone, 4 out of 5 people that were in solitary for their, again, I would say for minor offenses. These are folks who are, you know, for drug use, for missing their programs, you know, for trying to using their phone when not supposed to. You know, like these offenses that really actually don't cause any danger, but just, you know, impact maybe the rules of the facility, but are not necessarily like the most dangerous, which you would think, you know, folks would be in there for years for. So part of that is just combating the narrative about who's in there, you know, and then being very intentional about having people in the room who are impacted by it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's so helpful. And you're right, just to lay out some of the misconceptions that people have so that you can then know them, understand them. And then, as you've both pointed to again and again, really making sure that the people who have direct experience who can speak to it, lifting up those voices is just so critical. Thank you.
Yeah.
A couple state specific questions. We've got a question about what's happening in North Carolina, what's happening in Pennsylvania, Illinois, Iowa, New York. I don't know if you want to point folks to links or if you can speak to those.
I do want to lift up one resource that we'll make sure that folks have access to, but the Unlock the Box campaign, so of the campaign of which NearCat is a founding member, has an interactive national map, so that it's a great way for you to be able to sort of see the policies that have been introduced in various states around the country. NearCat also has a webpage that I can share that lists our core, the 20 core partners and the campaigns in the states where legislation is active. And so, you know, in states, I will just give start a brief thumbnail sketch, and Johnny is really the one that can give you the rundown here. But just, I think the thing that's important for everyone to know is that we Unlock the Box and NearCat have web pages to send you to find your state and really dig down deeper. You know, certainly in some of the states that we've mentioned, you know, including New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, where bills have actually been passed into law banning prolonged isolation, implementation and the work to ensure that that law becomes reality is really the key. And then in most other states, we're really looking at that ongoing campaign work to garner the legislative support from the governor needed to win on the legislation. I also just want to make note that, and this ties back to the alternatives conversation too, that we have seen in states like North Dakota and Colorado in past years where significant administrative changes have taken place around solitary, not through the legislature, but through other direct advocacy with prison administrators. And as a part of that, one piece of that puzzle has actually been exposing heads of departments of correction to internationally other ways of doing and being. And the Norwegian prison system in particular has presented some powerful examples of alternatives, and alternatives that are really focused on during incarceration, moving people in a way that they are gradually advancing towards greater freedoms in their living circumstances, responsibilities, and environments, so that they are being prepared as neighbors who will be returning to our communities. So, you know, there are paradigms out there that even if you're in a state where there's not legislation yet, to be really looking into some of those alternative paradigms and beginning to talk to your legislators about that, as well as these other bills that have already, you know, become a reality, can be really important. So I just wanted to put that in there, that yes, there are 20 state campaigns where if you're in one of those states and you're not plugged in, we want you to plug in. But even if you're not in one of those places, we still need to get the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny and Laura, for those answers. And I also would just say that really fits with what we talk to our advocates about all the time, which is that we're doing work that we hope will have a return in the near term, that something will happen. But we also know this is really long-standing, vital work. And so part of the way that we come together is to change the conversation, have there be initiatives, people understand and learn more about other models. Again, get the legislation introduced at the state level, push alongside at the federal, have all of these tasks, educate people, educate our community, so this becomes part of the conversation of criminal justice reform more broadly and immigrant detention more broadly. We have a lot of people in our church very active on those issues, sometimes looking at different aspects than what we're discussing today. Sentencing reform, reentry programs, school to prison pipeline, broadly ending mass incarceration, a lot of really strong opposition to immigrant detention, opposition to private prisons. But really seeing that this is can be all connected and can really be mutually reinforcing, and we as advocates can lift up the other areas as we learn more. So thank you for that. I think maybe I'll take one or two more questions, and then we can turn it to you both for final words. Just a question here about access to mental health care in the prison system and what the connection is there. Johnny, you spoke about the impact on mental health, but is there anything kind of more you'd like to say about that within the prison system?
Yeah, I would say that healthcare professionals are definitely on the same page about how bad and torturous the practice is. One of our partners is Social Workers Against Solitary Confinement. They come together to advocate, both at the state and national level to other health practitioners inside of these spaces around the issue of dual loyalty, where they've actually had to come face to face with some of the atrocities around, being able to give mental health services, but also coming face to face with the issue of security, which is in every single prison. Right now, as it stands, people in solitary confinement do have limited access to mental health services, and in practice, it looks even worse. There's sometimes when, the mental health professional may come to the door and also has a correctional officer next to him or her, so there's no confidentiality, or you're forced to share, things about your health that, while your cellmate is inside of the cell, etc. So yeah, to answer the question directly, like, is it tied? Yeah, I think that when you put somebody in a space that disturbs someone's mental health, and then you also limit their access to mental health, is exactly why and how we see that 50% of suicides inside of a carceral setting happening inside of a solitary setting. Yeah, I don't know what else to add to it except that the professionals are on board. And I think, like, in some states, was it Connecticut? Just thinking about the whether the nurses unions, social workers who've just really stood up against the issue. Even some leading practitioners like Dr. Terry Cooper, who's like studied this extensively to share like what are the mental health impacts of it.
Thank you. And then there's a question here, just has anyone done the math on the cost to society? I know that there's been some more research, the Solitary Watch report, but has there been a kind of holistic assessment of what the cost to society is?
I'll start off and get to Laura. I think if you're thinking about numbers and dollars, to be frank, we don't necessarily win the argument on the front end. Because what we're advocating for sometimes does cost a little more. We're advocating for, healthcare and not the punishment of solitary, and what the alternatives look like. But over the long term, we win the argument and reduce recidivism, healthier communities, healthy people, healthier families. Again, we're taking people who been in solitary 5, 6, 7 years and then saying, oh, by the way, you're going home now, directly into a place like 42nd Street, which is like information overload, and asking them to just re-enter as if nothing happened. I'll mention as well, though, like there's different ways of looking at it. On the structural side, we've seen actually prisons close as a result of advancing legislation around solitary, specifically in Connecticut and in New York, where now, these funds, these budgets have been shrunken, and the money's not going to these structures that are just no longer exist because we've dedicated entire buildings to solitary confinement. So on that end, it's definitely a savings for the state when you're dedicating so much real estate to such a horrible practice. And then, of course, there's the human cost, which is immeasurable. And it's literally immeasurable. Someone told me the other day, I was recently in Missouri, where I learned that they actually keep people in solitary there. Many of the young folks are there in solitary. And they're like, hey, Johnny, we need to get a reparations bill in solitary, as they legalize it, all of that, like just the death of like the pain that's like running into these communities. So the cost is immense. I think that conservatives think about that as a number in dollars kind of sense, like how much is it going to cost per dollar? New York did do an assessment during the Hawk campaign, that actually looked at a long-term financial savings of ending solitary confinement in the millions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for also just highlighting the human cost. I mean, that's the cost that we know is the one that can be hard to even grapple with. Looking at the numbers and looking at just the amount of time and the number of people affected. Just any last words as we wrap up here that you'd like to share with our network today?
I'll say a little something and then give the final word to you, Johnny. Rebecca, I think you mentioned this, but I just wanted to underscore the point that, this issue of working together from a moral perspective to end the torture of solitary is one that touches on so many facets of the criminal legal system and the immigrant system. So, when we consider, a vast majority of ICE deaths in ICE happen in solitary confinement. Solitary is a reentry issue. It matters what happens to people inside when they come home. How are they being returned home? In what condition? And this is at its heart a racial justice issue. What does it mean for people of color to disproportionately be impacted not only by our sentencing laws, but all the way through the system itself, to ultimately be facing some of the most horrific conditions once they are inside. And so, yeah, just a word of encouragement to everyone that, regardless of what brought you here today, that there's a piece of this where we need your voice, and it's important for you to be a part of this, and that, there's a vibrant community of people at work and that we would love to have you be a part of. So, we're just excited that you've invited us to be a part of this conversation today, and we really hope we can build on it with all of you. So I'll pass it to Johnny.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just add, I'm always reminded that there are people that care. When I was in solitary confinement, I was made to believe that conversations like this were not existing, that people, they would barely pay attention. I've been told to my face, I can kill you in here and no one would ever know or ever care. So not only is the reward is the work meaningful for me, but I want to let folks know that there are people inside who think that you don't care, and part of the work is just to engage, do whatever you can. I mean, from being able to send letters, we have a pen pal program, to being able to screen one of our films inside of your space or in your network, whether it's on Zoom, in person, however you're able to do it. And I think about solitary like this large monster, right? Like, some of us can probably just grab the tail, grab the ear, or whatever that looks like, but like collectively, we can definitely, overcome it. And that's what wakes me up every day, and allows me to like continue fighting. And as a parent who's experienced this, I would definitely want to make sure that I live in a world to help create a world where my kids don't have to experience this as well. So with that, I'm just grateful to be in community with you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Laura. Thank you to everyone at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture for the work you do and for helping us to be a part of it and join you in that. It's really meaningful for us to be able to walk alongside you in this. So thank you to our webinar attendees for joining, and those of you watching later, again, please get involved, advocate, learn more, stay connected, and just again, we're so grateful to you, and we will move forward with this together. Thanks to everyone.